We've commonly heard it said that the Great War was expected to be quick and decisive, that the powers that be had no intention of waging a several-year-long attrition war which would destabilize the great powers and bring conflict to virtually every corner of the globe. This had certainly been the case for Germany, as was made evident by the confidence invested into the Schlieffen Plan, to knock out the French early on, circle back, and focus the remainder of the war on Russia, preventing a two-front conflict. The Germans, as many of us know, are renowned for their organizational skill and efficiency in combat. The Schlieffen Plan then is perhaps a fine example of what occurs when so much is invested into a singular, seemingly foolproof plan that alternatives and contingencies remain off the table for if and when the plan fails, as this one ultimately did. The plan was named after and developed by Field Marshal Count Alfred von Schlieffen, a man with earlier aspirations of a career in law, who found himself pulled into the world of military planning on account of the remarkable skill he demonstrated during his mandatory year of duty, excelling in this field for what would become 53 years of service, expressing that it wasn't originally his intention to become a strategist, rather, he was simply born to become one, that it was his destiny, you might even say, all part of a grander plan. At the time, Germany had proved itself to hold an upper hand over France in regard to military strength, strategy, and organization, something quite evident since the humiliating defeat of the French during the Franco-Prussian War. As such, France sought out a means of reasserting itself against Germany, doing so by establishing an alliance with Russia, thus forcing the Germans to fight on two fronts should they go to war with either. Being dramatically outnumbered by this joint force and needing to have its resources split along opposite sides, von Schlieffen considered several strategies which, in such a circumstance, could still ensure a German victory. The answer generally manifested in the form of turning the two-front offensive into a one-at-a-time offensive, eliminating one of the two allies quickly before moving on to the other. Von Schlieffen saw that Germany had at its disposal an extensive railway network with which to transport its troops to and from either front. However, based upon his calculations, even in a best-case scenario, if the Germans were to launch an offensive against France, there simply wouldn't be enough time or manpower to bring about a French surrender and move troops to the Eastern Front before Russia made a significant advance. Von Schlieffen would later observe in 1905 how miserably Russia had performed against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, and noted that at least under current circumstances of underdevelopment, poor leadership, and low levels of organization, Russia, should it attempt to face Germany even with allied France, could not pose a significant threat to the Eastern Front as was previously expected, and would likely only require of the Germans a minor land force to secure this region, allowing the majority of German soldiers and supplies to be moved westward. These assumptions of Russia would prove themselves to be true, as even despite ordering an early general mobilization, the Russians found themselves woefully underprepared, not even having established a sustainable means for its allies to supply them. So the plan was decided. A seemingly large number of German soldiers would be positioned along the fortified Franco-German border as a lure for the majority of French forces to station themselves there. A larger number of soldiers, the true invasion force, would then route through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, capture Paris, and encircle the French army. From there, Germany would freight its Western Front soldiers to link up with the bare minimum force tasked with guarding the East, and finally launch an offensive against Russia. Von Schlieffen would eventually find himself retired and succeeded by Helmuth von Moltke, a strategist beset by doubts of German success and overestimations of Franco-Russian capabilities. It would be under von Moltke the Younger that the Schlieffen Plan would be significantly altered, calling for additional troops in eastern Germany and cutting the Netherlands out of the plan as to deny Britain any right to occupy it, but in doing so costing German soldiers access to northern railways, ultimately slowing the advance and allowing for both the French and Belgians to destroy their own railroads before they could be used by the Germans. This, along with Belgian resistance, would have delayed the German advance sufficiently enough for France to remobilize, bringing the war into the deadlocked state it would be left in for multiple years. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Schlieffen Plan actually worked? It's clear von Moltke's modifications to the plan had hindered its function, a plan which in good deal depended upon both an overwhelming force and element of surprise, had sacrificed essentially all it had going for it out of fear, for the sake of trying to play it safe. The modifications, however, aren't solely to blame for the plan's failure. Germany direly needed Belgium and, in the circumstance of the original plan, the Netherlands to cooperate if it was to surely defeat the French within a speedy time frame. Not merely resistance from the Belgians, but also Britain involving itself on behalf of Belgium is also an issue. The idea had originally been that Germany could subdue France so quickly that Britain's involvement wouldn't matter by the time it finally arrived, but as we saw in our world, that wasn't the case. Had Belgium and the Netherlands allowed Germany to pass through its borders peacefully, Britain was still secretly obligated to support France in the event of a German war, and also maintained interest in securing the Channel from threats like Germany. However, divides within the government between anti-war and pro-war factions in the absence of a neutrality violation may be sufficient to hinder British action. Cooperation from the Belgians also means German forces aren't needed as an occupational force to subdue Belgian resistance, nor are rail lines destroyed, allowing a fully stocked all-present army to be speedily deployed to France before a response to Germany's strategy could be produced. We'll suppose for the sake of this scenario that the Schlieffen Plan is carried out as initially intended, and with the full cooperation of Belgium and the Netherlands. In the west, the French army is swiftly crushed. In the east, the Germans would be less secure against the Russians during the Battle of Tannenberg. However, in our world, the Germans still managed to inflict in this battle over 10 times as many casualties than the Russians had, even with still much fewer soldiers, utterly destroying the 1st and 2nd Russian armies. Now, under the conditions of the original Schlieffen Plan, the Germans would be even fewer in number, but given the outcome of the conflict in our world, it doesn't seem very unlikely for the Germans to hold their ground. Even so, had the Russians won, this battle's purpose was primarily to buy the soldiers on the Western Front time to circle back, at which point the Russians would be driven out and defeated. The so-called war to end all wars never happens, and instead the outcome is much like many others which preceded it, perhaps coming to be known as the Franco-German War or the Austro-Russian War depending on which country you ask. In essence, this scenario is somewhat similar to what may have happened had Germany won the Great War, however, the victory is much less dramatic. The power balance in Europe has changed, but conditions aren't as dire for the losers, nor is the destruction of the war as widespread. France is simply humiliated and relegated to 2nd place, Russian weakness in leadership is made clear earlier on, and continental power has shifted further from Western Europe to Central Europe. Germany would have thoroughly asserted its position of dominance over France and placed itself the new center around which continental Europe would spin, this power and prestige rubbing off on its allies as well. As spoils of war, many of France's colonies would be seized by Germany, notably Indochina, Morocco, and pieces of what would make up Germany's plan for a colony in Middle Africa. The Austrians would make the Serbs a client state to discourage and root out Serbian extremist groups, such as those who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. However, would also cede to the puppeted Serbia the lands of Bosnia as a means of appeasing the Serbian population, whilst maintaining general control over the region from behind the scenes. Eventually, the Austrians would find a resolve for the growing tensions within their borders, not needing to make hasty concessions under the pressure of a war. This could manifest in the form of Franz Ferdinand's proposed United States of Austria, or the granting of additional rights and securities to the empire's minority populations. Russia would see much of its far western lands broken away by Germany for the sake of establishing buffer states, thus weakening any future two-front attacks by the French and Russians. Russia, not having been pushed to the breaking point by years of war, never succumbs to communist revolution, however in defeat does see the Tsar reduced of power and a more democratic monarchy established, one that would certainly be kept in check by Germany if communism happened to arise. The Ottomans, by having attached their future to Germany, benefit significantly from this victory, receiving regular financial and military support from the continent's now leading power, which ultimately helps the Turks retain their empire, in turn helping Germany by securing for it a reliable source of petroleum, and negating further British and Russian expansion into the Middle East. Britain, absent a Franco-Russian victory, would gradually return to a policy of splendid isolation. Even as the British attempted to escape what Joseph Chamberlain described as Britain having no friends, it seemed to only emphasize its own desires for self-focus. The Anglo-Japanese alliance essentially amounting to Britain saying that it trusted Japan to look over things in East Asia, whilst the same went for the US and the Americas following the Venezuelan crisis. With its two major allies in Europe having failed to defeat Germany, and attempts at friendship with Germany having failed since Kaiser Wilhelm dismissed Otto von Bismarck, Britain would see its future as one of increased relations with its own colonies, and its two naval peers, the US and Japan, who didn't necessarily get along very well. Because the war never takes on a larger character, the US never sees an economic boom followed by a great collapse, but instead carries along in steady development, with occasional minor economic hiccups as would have historically been the case. As we've covered before, without need for the US to assume a leading global role, its focus instead remains fixed on the Western Hemisphere, managing the Central and South American nations and promoting its fashion of democracy across the Americas. People often forget that prior to the US's profiteering off the Great War, the nation was still on a significant economic incline. The late 1800s having seen the US achieve higher production outputs and higher per capita income than any other nation on the planet. This trend, given the US's increasing influence within its own hemisphere, is likely to continue. Additionally, we might see Woodrow Wilson narrowly lose the 1916 election to either Charles Evan Hughes or Teddy Roosevelt if he manages to win the Republican nomination. As without the Great War, Wilson would miss out on anti-war votes, which might otherwise align more closely with Hughes or Roosevelt. A Roosevelt victory might add additional years to the Progressive Party's lifespan, and see a term characterized by additional reforms and interventions in Latin America, possibly escalating the border war with Mexico, before Roosevelt's health ultimately failed him, leaving his final year in office to be carried out by his vice president, John M. Parker, a rival of Huey Long. With Germany and Britain emerging from the decade unscathed, much like Japan in our world, attention would shift to China following the fall of its imperial dynasty and destabilization after the death of its de facto leader, leaving it broken up among various warlords and primed for conquest. Germany would expand through its present sphere of influence in China, as well as through what would have been French claims north of Indochina. Japan, as expected, would seize Manchuria and central coastal lands, whilst Britain would dominate what remained. In addition to this, American presence in the Philippines could make of East Asia and the Pacific a prime field for the next decade of warfare, the Japanese and Germans competing over rights to Chinese land, whilst Britain and the US attempt to defend their present holdings. Without post-war destruction on the scale of the Great War, nor as widespread, with neither Britain, Italy, or even Bulgaria having had the chance to involve themselves in this conflict, it's unlikely for radical ideologies like fascism and communism to rise to the prominence they would have achieved in the post-Great War era. As such, the Spanish Civil War, still occurring as a result of rising tensions between the left and right, takes on a clearer nationalist monarchist versus socialist republican character, with the nationalists still emerging victorious and seeing the Carlists assume a dominant role in the post-war period, placing their claim on the throne rather than the Alfonsists, who, though holding more significance in the build-up to the war, saw themselves overshadowed by the zeal and intensity of the Carlist movement. Italy, in the absence of the crippling impacts of the war, still goes about attempting to expand its dominance in the Mediterranean and as a colonial empire. Italy had still been flirting with authoritarian policy at the time out of necessity, having to manage a rocky economy and increasing political tensions throughout the country. Prior to World War I, the Socialist Party had assumed a prominent role in Italian politics, and it's quite possible in this alternate world would come to form a defining movement in Italy, possibly led by Mussolini, who never breaks with the party over his views on the Great War. At some point, Germany might seek to purchase the Congo from Belgium as a means of bridging the gap between its East and West African colonies. The Belgians, should they turn down Germany's offer, might incite an invasion of the Congo or Belgium itself. Britain, recognizing this as a threat to its colonial interests in South Africa as well as an abuse of power over a neutral party, might justify itself in finally combating the Germans, bringing Europe's two greatest empires into conflict. This could serve as an opportunity for France and Russia to mount a comeback. However, given the additional time Germany and its allies would have had to solidify their power, a war between the two could go either way. Japan would likely align itself with Britain for the sole reason of gaining Germany's East Asian territories, whilst the US, not having established closer ties with Britain on account of the Great War, and seeing its old English elite in large part replaced by a new generation of Germans and Irish, would be even less supportive of Britain than in our world. Perhaps even favoring support of Germany alone, but likely trying to play fair to both sides. Growing Japanese and American tensions in the Pacific could lead the Japanese to cross the line, attacking an American vessel or military base, leading war to break out between the two, and in turn between the US and Britain. Traditionally, since Britain's old rivalry with France, the British had a strategy of seizing its opponent's overseas colonies through use of its naval superiority, depriving their opponent of resources, and generally just outlasting them through the conflict. Although this might be achievable in Africa and certainly in Asia with Japanese support, when it came to the Americas, Britain's possessions could now be seized near entirely, not only hurting Britain's war effort, but giving Germany's alliance a strong bargaining chip to reclaim its colonial possessions should the war end in a German defeat or stalemate. Britain and Germany would seemingly remain locked in a dynamic of German land dominance on the continent and British dominance of the sea. Failing to establish strong ties with the US and Japan, Britain found one of its potential allies on the side of its opponent, and the other only lending its support for its own selfish interests. It would be a sad reality for Britain, but it stood truly alone, an island among nations. The war would end, Britain conceding the Congo and Germany's occupied colonies in exchange for Canada and the Caribbean islands, while Germany and the US would continue their war against Japan. Austro-Hungary would lay claim to former French North and West African colonies, Germany seeing it necessary to enrich its allies to further secure its position in Europe, a strategy which Britain would have neglected and which now left it alone. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.